Michael, really like to get some of your responses to questions that students have raised about the narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass, the 1845 version. And the one that comes up and that seems most vexing has to do with the very unusual subject position that Douglass occupies as he narrates his life. He's on the one hand free in the sense that he is a fugitive slave, and he practices freedom in the activity of writing the narrative. But on the other hand, the narrative itself could function as a warrant for his rearrest, and his activity of remembering his experiences in slavery have the capacity, don't they, to recapture him within the traumatizing spaces evoked in those memories. How do you describe to your students the work this incomplete transition from slavery to freedom accomplishes in the writing of this narrative?
That's a great question. First of all, I think half of the effort of bringing students to this text is to have them realize just those paradoxes you're pointing out. That moment where Douglass is recalling the sound of slave song on a plantation, it coincides with an early moment of our own entry into this text. So in a way, it's as if our reading of his narrative of the slave past is almost like a tour of the plantation itself. And at the time, some of my research has involved historic plantation tourism that was ongoing in the 19th century. Wow. There's a great autobiography by Carolyn Seabury. She's one of these governesses who comes from the North to try to participate in educating the recently emancipated slaves. This is after emancipation, but there she talks about a plantation that people from the North had been going to tour even during the time of slavery. And many Northerners would exchange stories about their visits to the South and what it's like to hear slave song. So Douglass knows that his readers have many misconceptions about what it is to hear slave voice, to hear slave song. And he knows that the main misconception is that articulation of the slave voice in the moment of work, under the sun, during the day, would emote as joy or joyful to those who would be hearing it. That song sung during the work hour must be some kind of celebration of work to the New England white ear. And Douglass was very quick to point that out as a misconception, that people might be hearing the same thing, but the context of the frames by which we understand what we hear are very different, and that the sounds of the African voice in a Southern context is never reducible to joy, and that it brings about in the narrative a kind of frisson for Douglass, and hopefully a frisson for the reader as well. That we are outside, just as he's outside of himself as narrator and must re-experience the moment where he is imagining himself as an interloper to the Southern plantation, even though in the memory he's returning to the memory of the Southern plantation. He is himself in this impossible position, both remembering the slave song and now mishearing it at the same time, like his white tourists may be mishearing it. In the act of retrospectively going back.